Hello and welcome to the Good Practice Podcast, a weekly show about work, performance and learning. I'm Garner, and this week we're discussing creativity and innovation. What do these terms mean? Can anyone be creative? And is it time we stopped talking about innovation altogether? I'm joined as usual by regular contributor Owen Ferguson. Hello, Owen.
Greetings of the day to you, good sir.
Oh my good heavens. I was unprepared for that. And a return guest to the podcast, serial doodler Simon Heath. Hello, Simon.
Hello, chaps, and everyone listening. I'm calling in from not the medieval times, which is where I think Owen's greeting comes from.
Oh, you're on an iPad. You're solidly up to date.
A thoroughly modern man.
Yeah. Owen's got his notes on a scroll. Simon, could you get started? I'd like to talk a little bit about your credentials and your journey. I know that's a terrible term, but you do now, as I understand it, draw doodles for a living, and I'd love to hear about how you ended up in this ostensibly creative role.
So without wanting to take the entirety of the broadcast with my life's journey, I worked for a long time in let's use air quotes here, a proper job at sort of like the most senior levels of a couple of fairly well-known organisations, and I ended up there having started in corporate life in the post room. So I have literally done more or less every role from post room to boardroom. What that's given me is a kind of a really warts and all view of how the world of work operates or doesn't. And when I was made redundant in 2012, a load of people reminded me that they used to bug me when I was at school that I ought to be an artist for a living, because I was good at it at school. I used to get told off for doodling in class and doing cartoons of the teachers and fellow pupils. So a load of people reminded me of that, and I've kind of figured out that it's possible to do it for a living without destroying the joy of being a creative, if you do it on your own terms. And it's also possible to use my experience of the world of work to apply that creativity to helping other people kind of wrestle with the challenges that they've got. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. That was quite a big nutshell, but it'll have to do.
Could you go maybe a little bit more specific though? Because I think to anyone listening, that's going to sound a little vague. So what do you do?
Well, so often it's very difficult for people to express exactly what it is that they have in front of them. So usually I'm usually involved when there's some sort of change or transformation going on in an organization, or someone has articulated a desire to change, but they can't. They're having trouble talking about that, or they might be having trouble talking about that amongst themselves at a senior level, or they might, having made the decision, be having difficulty talking about that with the other people they want to come on the journey with them. And part of what I do is to interrogate them and the process and what's behind it, and turn that into an actual visualization of what's going on, or what needs to happen, or the kind of the core concepts and issues around it, so that they've actually got something to work with. So, it helps them develop a common language, perhaps a shorthand, some visual shorthand, so that when they refer to a particular thing, they're all on the same page.
Yeah. So one of our recent episodes, a couple of weeks ago, we did one on the language of L&D, and one of the problems that we were talking about is that often in a business context you will have people using rather vague language and apparently in agreement, but from the outside it can appear that they don't even understand each other and they're talking about completely different things. And so it sounds like what you're doing is you're forcing people in a room to come to common understanding by showing them what they're saying, and they can't get away with being vague because you have to create something off the back of it. Is that fair to say?
Yes, and it's also fair to say that it's harder to sort of dodge it because you've had a hand in creating it, unless you're Michael Gove, of course. But it's
we're not political on this podcast.
No. That wasn't political. That was just a bit of
that was a character statement.
People often avoid taking responsibility or carrying accountability for a particular thing because they aren't involved in its creation. This is about getting people around the table and actually creating a thing. So this is something, this is an interesting thing around creativity, is that unlike a lot of people in the modern world of work, I have, at the end of the day, something to show for what I've done all day. Whether that means I've been productive or not is a completely different matter. But it's unusual to get a group of people in a room together nowadays and actually have a tangible thing that can be taken away and used to work with other people on. A lot of stuff disappears into devices and that doesn't necessarily come out again. But this is a kind of more of a living process. But again, it is about if it's done well, that co-created bit means that people are more vested in it.
So that sounds like quite an innovative approach to me. But I want to bring in Owen at this point because he also has been on his journey through the corporate world, and I'm interested how much innovation, Owen, you have seen in your corporate journey.
I think. Some of it comes down to how you define what is meant by innovation. So if you look up the dictionary definition, Collins Dictionary defines it as a new thing or method of doing something, which is really generic and broad. So I could say to that, absolutely, I see innovation absolutely everywhere. But that doesn't feel particularly useful. But look, we work in an organisation that is packed with creative people, and one of the purposes of the organisation is to harness that creativity and turn it into something that affects the real world. And so for me, that's kind of like the coming up with the ideas or the concepts is kind of like the creative part. Innovation is how do I transition, how do I turn that into something that can be used by other people, and how do I scale it?
I mean, that's a good answer, but to a different question.
Yeah.
So I asked what innovation you had seen throughout your career, and maybe not the Collins Dictionary version of innovation, but the kind of keynote speaker, business books. We're going to come and help you. We're going to teach a class on innovation to your top executives. That kind of like fancy innovation.
Well,
Simon, have you seen this in action? Owen was going to say something.
Yeah. It's how big would something need to be for it to be considered innovation? Because you can look at smartphones and say, right, there's an innovation. There was a very obvious inflection point. But the reality is most innovation tends to be somewhat incremental, and it's improving something that's already there, or replacing something that's already there with something better. So if I think about, like, in my own sort of personal workplace, the way that we approach software development, we have gone through various iterations of making that process, we think, better. So I see, so I have seen it. I'm just not sure whether it would be no one's going to go and do a conference talk about that.
Yeah, I always talk about these things as having a big or a small first letter. So Owen is talking about small I innovation, which is that incremental stuff. I mean, if you think about, there's a sort of mythologizing about particular things and people who are associated with them. So if you look at smartphones, well, so we had phones before, we had personal, music devices before. The actual a smartphone itself isn't the innovation. It's the bringing together of all those things. It's a kind of like a bit like Henry Ford's thing. If he'd asked people what they wanted, they'd have said faster horses. Well, a lot of what we get is just making horses go faster. There aren't, no one has, no one's designed a car. Elon Musk is doing great work with Tesla and SpaceX, but he hasn't invented spaceflight. He hasn't invented the car. He's invented a new method for making a car. He hasn't even done that. He's just invented a new method for getting the wheels to turn on a vehicle. It's not, so innovations are kind of big eye innovations, are seismic events that change the course of history, and we don't, that those things aren't there. The sage on the stage talking about innovation and things, it's not resultant in that. Precisely because it is all dependent on context. Sitting a load of people in a room and asking them to be innovative without context is not going to produce any innovation, apart from maybe new ways of torturing each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's perfectly okay for companies to not be innovative in that kind of larger sense. So if you think about Belkin and Anchor, right, who make cables and ports and hubs for things, like, they are not inventing new things. Basically, they exist to turn around and say, can I make a nice one of these cheaply? And that's the challenge that they've got. So that's innovation, small I, both of which are very successful companies. So, they're not they're not Google and they're not Apple. They're not lauded for, massive advances in machine learning or the purity of their design, but they're very successful companies. Like, not everyone's going to be a behemoth, and that's fine, I think.
Yeah. Yes, because just purely on all sorts of sort of ecological levels, if you think about it like that, an environment cannot sustain if everyone is the same size. So you have to have some sort of gradation in scale and approach and ability and so on. And that is good, and in many respects that's perfectly healthy, so long as the scale doesn't bring monopoly.
Yeah, and you referenced Apple and Google as examples of innovative companies. They also are not necessarily transforming the world every single year. Google created an excellent search engine. It wasn't the first search engine, and ever since then they've been making it a bit better all the time. Yeah,
although adding lots of other services. So I think that's maybe one of the areas where Google's slightly different, in that they've got they've made investments in other arms and essentially said, take your nascent great idea and go and turn it into something.
Yeah.
And they've also, because of their scale, they've been able to buy in a lot of innovators and innovative organisations. Google, I think Google bought Boston Dynamics and so on. All those scary robots. So you can't do that if you're small. So you have to, it's at the lower end, you maybe are more nimble and agile, and that's agile as in behavioural rather than the working methodology.
Yeah, and there's also, if you're that skilled, you can afford to take risks, and innovation, I think proper big eye innovation is generally going to be a risk as well. You have to create the space for people to be. You can't fire them if they get it wrong. If you want people to be innovative.
Yes, and it's interesting about the kinds of people who tend to do this stuff more readily aren't necessarily the kind of people that you want to spend a lot of time with, because they are often not the best disposed towards working kind of well with others. It's interesting to look at the kind of people who are lauded. So you think about Picasso. We're all artists, or still like an artist. That's an interesting phrase, isn't it? But and then what kind of actual person he was to live with, and that's problematic. Steve Jobs, hailed by many, and yet very difficult person to be around, to work with for any length of time, and so on and so on. So if we're looking to, if we want people to be innovative, if we want people to be creative, then is there a trade-off perhaps in some way that it doesn't fit nicely in our in sort of corporate world, within organizations, which are kind of there's a sort of dynamic equilibrium in organizations that they require all the parts to kind of vibrate in harmony, even whilst acknowledging they all do vibrate, but they're actually, if you can't introduce too much disharmony in there, because the whole edifice is then under threat.
I think as well, there's a recognition that innovation can happen, and creativity and innovation can happen in areas that might seem somewhat mundane initially. So there's a great example in Tim Harford's book Adapt, when he talks about making washing powder. So the way that you make washing powder is you spray a very fine layer of a substance onto a big dome, and then you let it dry and you scrape it off. And so the challenge was that sometimes it gets a bit clumpy and sometimes the layer's too thick, and so a group of people were given the challenge of making a better nozzle. And the way that they decided to approach that, this was the creative kind of spark, if you will, was that actually they split people into two teams, and one team worked with a bunch of scientists and engineers to go and make the best novel possible, and another bunch of people just started making nozzles of different variations and found whichever one of the variations worked best and then iterated on that. And that was just to make the process of making washing powder a little bit better. And that is entirely banal, but required a degree of creativity and thinking differently about a particular problem.
Yeah, and that's, I think, one of the things, but part of the problem with creativity and innovation is just general concepts, is that they aren't often linked to specific purpose. What problem is it we're trying to solve here? So you have a lot of, there's a lot of creative kind of L&D stuff around, and I know because I'm doing it, of getting people in a room and asking them to draw pigeons or stuff like that, which is fun and it's fine and it's a bit trivial, but it is, if you don't do that stuff and then apply it to a real world issue that those people are facing, then you might as well be doing a workshop on how to pot plants or crochet a scarf or whatever it is. That's a different thing. But helping people express themselves creatively is not going to move anyone along. Ultimately, whatever values they've got stuck on their wall or what their purpose is on their website, organizations have to continue to make money if they're going to exist. So they do need new nozzles. They need to do the stuff they do better and more cost effectively and well. And that's, it's when you can link getting people to be creative to a real world problem they can see and solve, then that's when it actually works and matters more.
When I was thinking about this topic, I was reminded of my very first e-learning course I built for GoodPractice. I had recently moved from writing for the GoodPractice Toolkit onto the e-learning side, and my boss, James McCluckey of this podcast, had asked me to go and make a course for a bank. And I came up with a really creative navigation system where at the start you would get given a credit card with your name on it, and you could tap it to various pay terminals to move around the course. It was absolutely innovative and very creative. It never saw the light of day because it did not solve a problem that existed. There already was a solution, and that was a button to move you through the course. You didn't need this ridiculously convoluted, innovative idea. And I think that's the difference, isn't it, that you were saying, Owen, between the creativity and innovation is it's okay to be creative and do fun stuff, but the innovation is that it actually has a purpose.
Well, no, I mean, I think if your creative idea had been a good one, Ross,
So it's like the nozzles. If only I had had 20 such ideas, one of them might have.
If it had worked, that would have been an advancement. We would have uncovered a new method of people navigating through a particular
transformed the internet.
In your own small way. But that's there's an example. I think you need to give people the space and the opportunity to come up with different ideas and to try them out. Because otherwise you're never going to end up with any kind of innovation if you just keep doing the same thing. So I think it's perfectly okay to have. I think it's great that you came up with that new thing, and I also think it's great that we decided not to go with it because it didn't work.
That's interesting, there, isn't it, about setting that tone? Because there's a lot of talk. When people bang on about creativity and innovation, they kind of, it sounds a bit like they've built. I've written about it before. I call it like the large human collider. Which is like under a mountain in Switzerland, you get people and fire them together, and if they do it often enough, then someone will come up with a bright idea. And there's in workplace design, there's this whole trope about serendipity, engineered serendipity. It's like if you can say Google, legend has it that Google engineer long queues in their cafeteria so that people will talk and have brilliant ideas and come up with brilliant new products. The reality is that if anyone has ever spent any time in a queue, especially in this country, is that hardly anyone ever talks to each other anyway. If they do, it's usually to complain about the weather or discuss football or Love Island or something like that. So it doesn't necessarily just putting people together. It doesn't necessarily follow that these things result in the same way. You don't just put people. There has to be some sort of, somebody has to be there, kind of stirring the pot and putting the right ingredients in at the right time for this stuff to actually result in something palatable at the end. Because otherwise, you just you're just a student with baked beans for breakfast.
I have a few thoughts. One is it Pixar or Apple that have the building that only has one toilet, something like that, to make sure that everyone's funneled towards the same place?
No, I think that was Pixar's building. That was originally Steve Jobs' intent, and Ed Catmull and John Lasseter persuaded him against that because it was a stupid idea.
Right. Okay. And that brings up my second point, which was that Simon, you with your large human collider, you spoke about someone having an idea. How much do you think it's the case that it is just one person who has an idea versus lots of people bouncing off each other?
It depends a little bit on. God, I hate that phrase. I use it so often. It depends. But one person is going to take the next step each time. But if you're doing it collectively, then you're kind of riffing on as each sort of iteration of the next stage comes out is articulated, then the next person builds on it. So I don't think a group, there won't necessarily, if you put a group in, not all the group will be able to claim the actual thing, because there'll be one person who catalyzes it, but it won't necessarily be the same person in every circumstance, because it depends what subject matter is, what that person's lived experience and knowledge and network looks like. There's so many variables in it that it's almost impossible. That whole I have my best ideas in the shower thing, well, everybody says that, but I mean, Christ almighty, if everyone was having brilliant ideas in the shower all the time, well, God, we'd be a completely different species. But what they mean is, like, I've had a great idea where to go on holiday this year, or what to get for Mum's birthday, or something like that. It's not kind of like I've just designed a new MRI machine or something like that. That it just doesn't happen that way. We are all organisations are packed full of creative people. but it's about how would you apply that? Who's the best creative to get in a room? If you've got someone who publishes novels in their spare time, well, maybe you need to have them working in the comms team rather than in accounts payable. Who knows about that stuff? Well, HR would know that. They've been through the hiring process. They know, in theory, they know their people. So it's about getting the right people in the room.
So you mentioned something there, Simon. Everyone can be creative, which I agree with. But I wonder whether some people, because of the nature of some workplaces, have just gotten out of the habit of it, and it's then hard for them to kick that in a workplace context.
A lot of people say to me when I'm doing the work I do, they say I can't draw, and I say, well, I'll just prove you wrong, and then we do an exercise, and I prove them wrong, and they're happy. But what they do is when they draw again, after 30 years or whatever it was, they draw the same they did the last time they drew, which was when they were 12. And a lot of people find that that there's something wrong with that. I actually think that's beautiful, because it doesn't matter. We're not conditioned to not be creative. We're conditioned to think that the expressed creativity is inadequate in some way because there are examples around us of where it's of exemplary creativity. So just because I think I shouldn't think badly about drawing like a 12-year-old because Leonardo produced the Mona Lisa. But that's the conditioning. So whether we, how do you recognise who's got the creative stuff and how it's expressed in the workplace? It's just about matching up. It's like anything else, isn't it? It's like, what skills do we need for this particular thing, and then how do we figure out whether we have the skills here already, or do we need to get someone in because that's what we need? And that's the it's about kind of approaching it from a different way. It's not going like, well, I can't be creative at work. It's like, well, I could be if it was this sort of thing.
Possibly as well, if I wanted to be. 'Cause I think that the world that you described, Simon, sounds very good for the organisation, and maybe attractive to people in the organisation, but maybe not. Don't know if I have said this before in this podcast, but I have a degree in creative writing. Creative writing and journalism was my undergrad, and the most I ever did creative writing was when I worked night shift in a youth hostel in Inverness. I did it for 6 months, and I wrote something in the region of 70,000 words of a novel. And then I got a job at GoodPractice, and thus ended my aspirations to finish that novel, because suddenly I was being asked to write all day for work. That's grand. I like my job, Owen, fear not. But my creative passion was...
Just can't help but feel that you're blaming me for this. I've stolen the next great novelist from the world.
Crushed by my creativity being commoditized by GoodPractice for their own commercial gain. And so I can well imagine a situation where someone works in accounts payable and paints in the evening and has no interest in... that intrinsic motivation to do the thing that they love, having that be a paid part of their role for the benefit of the organisation.
Yes, so that's absolutely right. Of course, is that why? Yeah. So when I started out doing this, when I was a kid, one of the reasons why I didn't go on and do art in some form as a job when I was 19 was because I couldn't imagine sort of selling my soul to some corporate to do it, in the world of work.
You develop a taste for it after a while.
After a while, it turns out it's fine. But the reason I'm self-employed now is because I want to do it on my terms, which means I work with the people I choose to work with rather than the people I'm obliged to work with, and I have a fairly sort of free hand to do it the way I want to do it, to show up how I show up, to dress how I want to dress, and that's a massive luxury. but if I had to do what I do in a suit and tie, it would be almost psychologically impossible for me to do it.
Yeah. Well, we are running out of time. I have a few more questions I want to ask, but I'll just ask one. So we work in creative roles in the sense that we literally create stuff. A lot of people in large organizations don't work in quite so creative a role. What avenue is there for these people to be creative? Should they be creative? Should we be encouraging that? How do we do that? I said it was one question, it's four.
So I watched a program a little while ago. It's a bit old-fashioned, isn't it, on the television? Which was about the factory where they made the first mini cars, not skirts, and it was run on progressive principles. That it was run as a sort of community, and there were lots of family days and things like that. And the people interviewed, and these are people who were interviewed long after they finished working there and long after the factory had gone, spoke so fondly, lovingly about the experience that they shared working there. And one of there was things like, you know, there were art classes and pottery making and things like that, and they weren't things that were done because they had any particular direct effect on productivity or profitability, although they undoubtedly did. But it was run sort of fairly altruistically. So I don't know necessarily that we need to give sort of provide stuff because it helps the corporate. It's a bit like all a lot of well-being initiatives and things like that. It's kind of like, well, we just do it because it's the right thing to do. So, you know, why not give employees some, you know, a small amount of money that they can spend on creative pursuits, you know, buy them tickets to galleries. Not everybody will want to take up the offer, but if you made it available, then, you know, if you sent an email to a whole floor in a building and said, you know, here's free tickets to go to see the latest exhibition at the National Gallery, a load of people would stick their hand up, and that's a great thing.
They would probably go together.
Yeah, and they would probably, you know, talk in the taxi on the way there and come up with a brilliant idea and go off and start their own company.
So this is a risk management thing that you're talking about here, Simon. Stop this from happening, just in case.
All right, I'm going to wrap us up on that note. Let's move on to our regular feature of What I Learned This Week, where we each share something we picked up over the past 7 days. Owen, do you want to go first?
Sure thing. So this week, so it's not really something that I learned just this week. It's something that I have come to realize over a period of time, over some weeks, but very recently realized. So for whatever reason, I have avoided Reddit as a place to check out online, and I've maybe been put off by some high profile unpleasant aspect of it, like all of the political conversations, or maybe it's just the awful design of the site itself. But
it is awful.
I was drawn to it because I was looking for book recommendations. So I'm a massive fan of fantasy novels. So Dragonlance, A Song of Ice and Fire, Kingkiller Chronicles, The First Law, all those sorts of things. Usually trilogies, sometimes more. And I have discovered that the fantasy subreddit, r/fantasy, is an amazing community of people who all love fantasy books. So I downloaded an app, Apollo, which has got a really nice interface for Reddit. And what I'm finding is that r/fantasy is now one of my daily go-to places online. I check it out every day to see the new conversations that come up. So I've come to this. I have learned that I am a convert to Reddit, and I'm on the hunt now for other subreddits to go and check out.
Right. Yeah, that is interesting. I'm not a Reddit person either. I've never been particularly into online communities. I know that sounds really weird, but in to go to a forum and read stuff, it's just not been my scene. But how interesting. Simon, what have you learned this week?
Yes, Ken Robinson. Ken Robinson and I think it's still the most viewed TED talk or online YouTube talk of all time, where he basically said that creativity is progressively crushed out of us through school, university, and then workplace, and cited a particular study. And then Harold Jarch, I don't know if you guys know Harold. He's a Canadian guy. He's absolutely incredible, personal knowledge mastery. But he wrote a blog post that he was sparked by another talk given by a lady called Elizabeth McClure. And it turns out, so she is in innovation at Lego. She was curious about Ken Robinson's thing, so she went looking for the original study, and was surprised to find that none of the organisations involved in the study had any knowledge or recollection or records that the study had even taken place. So that sort of was an interesting. So I said I'd having a bit of an existential crisis because I had quite merrily leapt aboard the Ken Robinson bandwagon, only to find that perhaps his sort of central plank of his argument was based on a study that hadn't actually happened. So if you want to check out that. It's Elizabeth spelt with an S and McClure McClure. You can find it easily online if you just Google her name and creativity to see an alternative take on creativity to Ken's original.
Oh goodness! It's like all these things keep toppling down. As soon as someone decides to scrape under the surface, it'd be interesting to see where that one goes. Surely Ken must have some kind of rejoinder to that.
Yes, and it's worrying because a lot of people have kind of almost built businesses based on the idea that all this creativity has been crushed out, and in fact it's still there. It's just apparent in a different way, or I don't know. But that's why I was having my existential crisis. It was like, wow, should I be doing what I'm doing at all because it's all built on a tissue of whoppers?
Well, I don't think what you do has been directly correlated to Ken Robinson's TED Talk.
Oh, well, if it were, I might be able to charge more.
Creative marketing.
I'll finish up with mine. I want to recommend an academic paper, sort of in the spirit of Owen Ferguson, and one that I am phenomenally late to reading. So this is in 1974, Daniel Kahneman and Tversky published Judgment Under Uncertainty, Heuristics and Biases. It's one of the most cited social science papers of all time and contributed to Kahneman winning the Nobel Prize, and it's got all sorts of fun descriptions about how our thinking is systematically wrong. It's one of the founding papers of behavioural economics, and it's free online, so I'll put a link in the show notes. Owen, I know that you're a fan of this paper as well.
I am. Well, I'm a fan of Kahneman Tversky, full stop. So for anyone who hasn't read Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, that should go onto the must-read list. It's the best synopsis of what we know to date about how we think, and more often than not, how we think incorrectly in certain situations. But what's great about that particular paper, in fact, all of their papers, is how succinctly and clearly and simply they document their ideas. So there's no highfalutin language to obscure the fact that you're trying to describe something relatively simple. They're describing something relatively complex, but using really simple language to get their point across. It is the absolute model of clarity, and more social science papers should be that good. But then, of course, we'd be awash with Nobel Prize winners, I suppose, if that was the case.
The ecosystem raises its ugly head once again. And that's it. That's all from us. If you'd like to get in touch with us about anything we've said on the show, you can tweet me at RossGarnerGP. You can tweet Owen
at Owen Ferguson.
And you can tweet Simon
at Simon Heath 1.
Simon, do you want to plug anything?
I just wanted to shout out, talking about creativity and things like that, a couple of people who do really good work, if that's okay. I think so Julie Dryburgh does some amazing stuff around what she terms the Imaginarium, which is this brilliant sort of format for L&D OD folk to kind of experiment in a completely unstructured way. That's fascinating. So check out Julie on she's at Fuchsia Blue on Twitter I'm sure we can link to some stuff for her. Rachel Burnham does brilliant work around sketchnoting, helping people do creative note taking. That's becoming a really decent skill to have in the workplace. And as ever, probably ought to call out the kind of the I almost want to use the word remedial there, but in a kind way, the work that Doug Shaw does, which is helping people with sort of resilience and well-being around expressing themselves artistically, and that I think is really important as well. So there's three folk there really worth following.
That's a very generous plug that you've given. So I'm going to turn to Owen for a slightly more self-serving one. Owen, do you want to describe what Good Practice do?
No. That's your job as host. That's the thing that you do. That's the thing you do that at the end of the show every week. You go, if you want to find out more about Good Practice and what we do, visit goodpractice.com, and you can tweet us at Good Practice or Good Practice AUS. You do that thing.
Oh, that was marvellous, though. So we have a performance support toolkit for leaders and managers and an LMS, and we create e-learning. So there's a more self-serving plug than Simon's generous version. Thank you for the support as ever, Owen. And finally, for all you diehards out there, please help us out by leaving us a review. It only takes a couple of minutes, and it would generously help others find this podcast. Thank you in advance. Until next week, bye for now.